The year was 2017. I was working a summer job, filing things and doing other repetitive office work, wondering, it sure is quiet here. I wish there was a way for me to read while I was doing all of this. If only there was a platform of books in an audio format. And suddenly, all the years of YouTube affiliate and sponsorships came back to me, and I finally downloaded Audible, and I took the dive into the world of audiobooks. Flash forward to 2020, and with the apps like Libby, Scribd, and Hoopla, audiobooks have become my most used form of reading nowadays. And so suffice to say, I have read a fair share of audiobooks. And so I wanted to make a video talking about my least favorite and my favorite audiobooks, but over the years I've noticed a lot of patterns and trends that introduce a lot of new factors into determining what's a good or bad audiobook, and how the execution of those factors affects how much I'll like a book. So this video is kind of half me labeling all those patterns and trends that I see, as well as giving you a bunch of recommendations and also letting you know about books that I would say avoid the audiobook and maybe go read the physical book instead. So the first category that I've labeled is called the bare minimum. These are books where the audiobook doesn't necessarily take away from the experience, it doesn't make the reading experience worse than if you were just to read the book, but it also doesn't add anything. They are simply the vehicle through which the words are transmitted into your ears, into your brain, and honestly, what more can you ask from an audiobook? That's what they're for. But these books aren't necessarily that memorable, and for some reason, a lot of these happen to be contemporary, probably because contemporary is very rooted in real life, and so it doesn't feel that special or memorable. And I'm referring to the audiobook, not necessarily the story, because the story itself is probably very good as well. So some of these include The Lines We Cross by Randa Abdelfatah, Since You've Been Gone by Morgan Matson, The Astonishing Color of After by Emily X.R. Pan, and Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. So these are books where I wouldn't necessarily say go out of your way to attain the audiobook, but if you want to listen to the audiobook, they're good, they're fine. The next category is narrated by the author. Having a story told by the person who wrote it can be very advantageous and actually positively affect the way that you're reading it and consuming that material. This works especially for memoirs because those are already people telling their own life story. But I don't know, it adds an extra dimension of realism and immersion into their story when you hear it actually told by them. So examples include Born a Crime by Trevor Noah or Becoming by Michelle Obama. Both of them happen to be very good speakers, and I found that while I was reading it, I almost felt the emotions on a stronger level, knowing that this was actually what they went through and these were actually the emotions that they were feeling and are still affected by today. I've also found that books narrated by their own authors work very well for poetry, with the examples such as Elizabeth Acevedo's work and Jason Reynolds' work. I would say that all writing in general relies on having a good cadence and flow of the words, but for poetry it's absolutely crucial. And with the case like Elizabeth Acevedo and Jason Reynolds, who've had experience with public speaking, they know exactly how to deliver their poetry and their words to make the utmost impact. Also, if you're not really well versed in poetry, pun intended, then listening to it spoken out loud can really help you get used to that kind of writing style. However, there is a caveat to authors narrating their own work, because sometimes authors can be great writers, but they might not necessarily be the best speakers and performers, because audiobooks are a performance at the end of the day. And where I saw this was in The Kite Runner by Khaled Hosseini and Exit West by Mohsin Hamid. Both of these books are very good and very well done, but I think I actually would have enjoyed them more if I hadn't read the audiobook. Both of these books have to do with very hard and serious topics, but I didn't feel like the authors were able to convey that emotion through their voice, and sometimes it almost felt monotonous. It didn't take away everything. I was still very much impacted by both stories, but I do feel like if I decide to reread it, I will go for the physical format. Going off of that point, the next category I have is the wrong narrator. Sometimes the people chosen to narrate a specific book aren't necessarily the best people that could be narrating that book. And I notice this a lot when it comes to having a language other than English featured in a story. So I can only speak to Arabic because that's what my family speaks, but I'm sure this exists for other languages as well. So examples of this include All-American Muslim Girl by Nadine Jolie Courtney, The City of Brass by S.A. Chakraborty, and We Hunt the Flame by Hafsa Faisal. I only listened to about 2 chapters of All-American Muslim Girl because the Arabic was so butchered. And it was even worse because the dialect of Arabic spoken in that book was exactly the same as the dialect that I speak, so I could just recognize everything wrong, and it was really irritating me. We Hunt the Flame is actually a really interesting case to talk about because the narrators are Steve West and Fiona Hardingham, which are actually very popular narrators for audiobooks. And Steve West actually narrates one of my favorite audiobooks that I'll talk about later, which is Strange the Dreamer. So I was so surprised to find that I didn't like the fact that he narrated this book. And that just goes to show how even if you are a very talented narrator, it doesn't mean that your voice will fit every book. It was just a little hard to fully absorb myself in this Arabian-inspired fantasy when so much of the culture and pronunciation had this Western tint to it. And aside from the language aspect, I think sometimes audiobooks have the wrong narrator because of the choices that they decide to make, usually in regards to the tone that they use and the cadence of their speech. This did also have something to do with why I didn't enjoy the City of Brass audiobook, but I don't remember exactly why because it's been a while. But I definitely saw this with Between Shades of Grey by Ruta Sepetys. I haven't even finished this book, but I decided to start reading the audiobook, I think last year. This book is a World War II novel, and devastating events start from the very beginning, but you wouldn't get that from the way the narrator was talking. The intonation just didn't fit what was going on, and that kind of dissonance made it really hard to listen to the audiobook. Next, we're going to talk about audiobooks that feature what I think are called the superhero. This is when an audiobook only has one narrator, but that narrator goes all out. And there are a few subcategories to this. So the first is doing multiple voices, and I will say that a lot of audiobook narrators do this when there's only one narrator, but not a lot of them do them really well. So really good examples of these include the Mistborn trilogy by Brandon Sanderson, The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna, and the Scythe trilogy by Neil Shusterman. The narrators for all of these audiobooks have such unique voices for each character that are consistent and seamlessly go between each of them. But also this strategy can go awry really easily. So you all know how much I love Percy Jackson, but I don't like the audiobooks at all. This is a case that when the narrator switches voices, those other voices come off as annoying. Another not so great one is the audiobook for The Raven Boys with Maggie Stiefvater. And to be honest, in general, I like the audiobooks for this series. The narrator does a good job of creating that whimsical southern atmosphere, but certain choices for the side characters were atrocious. Specifically Kavinsky. It made the whole second book so hard to listen to. The best way I can describe it is a mix of the Mad Hatter from Alice in Wonderland and that little gangster mole from Zootopia. I guess I could just say the guy from The Godfather, but I haven't watched The Godfather. It was so hard to take him seriously because he sounded like that. So that's a case where sometimes some choices aren't the best. The next subcategory of the superhero is the narrator that becomes one with the character. A really good example of this is Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine by Gail Honeyman, and perhaps this is just a symptom of how well Gail Honeyman wrote Eleanor Oliphant as a character. She has such a distinct voice. She is so quirky, but in the best way possible, like not in a I'm not like other girls kind of way. She's just so wrapped up in her own mind, has very little self-awareness, but the narrator portrayed that so well, and I loved getting to read that. One that I literally just finished before starting this video was You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. And this one actually was really good in doing the multiple voices as well as really embodying the main character. The narrator was able to portray a lot of the naive nervousness in the main character as well as the moments where she really stands her ground and is fierce, and also just embodies the fast inner monologue of a high school student. And I liked the way that she portrayed all the side characters and they didn't feel like they were too forced. The last section of the superhero is the narrators that create the right vibe. So for this one, I'm going to highlight Strange the Dreamer by LAINI Taylor and Pan's Labyrinth by Guillermo del Toro and Cornelia Funke. Both of these narrators are able to capture the fairy tale-like aspect of these stories amazingly. These are definitely stories where I think you should go for the audiobook as opposed to just reading the book, even though the writing in both of them is very beautiful. And especially if you're someone who doesn't really enjoy lyrical writing that much, I think listening to the audiobook would be really helpful because they're truly able to immerse you in that world and get across all the fantastical elements in a way that doesn't seem over the top. The last category of audiobooks I call the production. This is kind of self-explanatory. It's essentially where the audiobook itself is a form of art. It is a whole creative medium. And they include things that you just simply can't get with reading physically. I haven't read too many audiobooks like this, but the ones that I have are definitely some of my favorites of all time. The first one I'll talk about is The Goose Girl by Shannon Hale. This has a full cast of characters, even though the narration is limited to one character, our main character Ani. All the dialogue is done by unique actors, which makes it feel like you're watching something or you're in the scene itself. And by far my favorite part of this audiobook is that it has music. It has it at the beginning and ends of each chapter, but also spliced into really intense scenes. I think music is such a powerful tool for storytelling. That's why I love listening to movie scores, and I've always thought that it'd be great if audiobooks could have a score, even though it's kind of improbable since they're so long. But I was so surprised to find out that this one did have music, and it was just excellent. And the other one that I absolutely love is Echo by Pemu Ryan. Again, it has a full cast. Each perspective has its own narrator, but similar to The Goose Girl, what really makes this one stand out to me is the fact that music is involved. A magical harmonica plays a really big part in the story and is what connects all the different storylines, and when the harmonica is referenced and played, you hear it. And there's even like a full-blown orchestra at the end. And again, I think that's such a cool and unique experience that you can only get from the audiobook. So those are some of my thoughts about audiobooks that I've read in the past few years. Despite the select audiobooks that I didn't happen to enjoy, I'm really glad that audiobooks have such a resurgence and are so popular right now. They make reading so accessible, and they're also just a new art form to explore, which is kind of cool. Please let me know some of the best audiobooks that you've listened to, and even some worst if you've had some particularly bad experiences. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you later. Bye!